All right, good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. Ms. Lincoln, will you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Cardenas?
Here.
Commissioner Hatch?
Here.
Commissioner Hayward?
Here.
Chair Matich?
Here. Good morning, everyone. I wanted to begin by thanking everybody for accommodating our 11 o'clock start time this morning. The legislature had invited us over this morning to be presented with a joint resolution or recognizing the 45th anniversary of the Political Reform Act. So that's where we were this morning. That's why we started late, and we appreciate you accommodating that. And it was a great honor, I think, for all of us to be recognized by the legislature in that way. So. With that, let's begin with public comment on items that are not on the agenda. Do we have any such public comment? Seeing none, we'll move to item number 2, approval of the July 2019 Commission hearing minutes. Do any commissioners have any changes, edits to the minutes? Seeing none, is there any public comment on the meeting minutes? Seeing none, do I hear a motion to approve?
I move to approve.
Second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Yes.
The motion passes.
Moving to the enforcement consent calendar, items 3 through 7. Do any commissioners wish to pull any of the matters from the enforcement consent calendar?
Yes.
Commissioner
I wish to remove item 3, and it involves a firefighters union, and the parent organization was my client for decades. So out of an abundance of caution, I would like to recuse myself from that item.
Okay. Any other commissioners?
I would like to talk about item 6. Will not necessarily pull it.
Okay. All right, then can I get a motion then, if no one has further matters to pull, a motion to approve on the consent calendar items 4, 5, and 7, and we can take up 3 and 6 separately.
Also move.
Second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Yes.
The motion passes.
All right, beginning with item 3 then. Is there any commission discussion on item 3? Okay. Any public comment on item 3? Chief of Enforcement West, do you wish to offer any comments on item 3? All right. Do I have a motion on item 3?
I move approval of item 3.
Second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Yes.
The motion passes.
Hopefully didn't go too far. You found somebody to talk to.
Welcome back. Thank you. All right, moving to item 6. Commissioner Hayward, you had expressed an interest in discussing item 6.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple of things, more or less just for the record, to clarify what I had noted in this matter about the $5,000 cashier's check. The way I read this stip, especially the language on page 7, which reads, "The loan is purportedly from Marquez but was not drawn from an account in Marquez's name, and no documentation was provided to substantiate this claim." That is the cashier's check. I read that to mean that we knew it had come from some secret place, and therefore all sorts of alarm bells went off in my head about intent and fraud potentially and other things. I think Ms. West, outside of our meeting today, clarified for me that this was not the case, but could you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Certainly. Galena West, Chief of Enforcement. Yes, because the way the sentence was written is a reflection of the statute, which is not drawn on the name of an account, which is the requirement for cash expenditures, contributions. And what it should have said or meant was the cashier's check didn't indicate what account it was drawn from. And so different language would probably made that interpretation a little easier. But yes, so we were just reciting kind of the statutory requirement for the violation as opposed to trying to make a statement as to conclusively we knew it wasn't her money.
I just wanted that clarified. If anyone looks at this stip ever again in the future, they'll maybe have a little more clarity. And with that, I would move approval of 6.
Well, is there additional commissioner comment?
I just put further clarification on that. So are you saying you knew the source and you knew it wasn't from her? It was,
We don't know the source, but we don't know it's not from her. She purports that it is from her, but didn't have
oh, so you
the
don't.
documentation.
Yeah, you don't have the ability to determine,
Exactly.
okay.
Is there any public comment on item 6? Seeing none, do I have a motion?
I will move approval of item 6 now.
Second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Yes.
The motion passes.
Moving on to item 7. This is the notice of a default proceeding. Do any commission members have any comment on item 7?
Just a question.
Do we, sorry, we did. We approved that as part of the consent calendar.
Did this person ever surface since last month? I mean, have they made any
No.
contact at all? Okay.
All right, moving to item 8. This is the assignment of a hearing to an administrative law judge. Chief of Enforcement West and Executive Director Jones are recommending that the ALJ conduct that hearing. Do any commission members have any comment on item 8? Seeing none, is there any public comment on item 8? All right. Item 9 is the Enforcement Task Force. Some time ago, the commission impaneled an enforcement task force to study and review various aspects of the enforcement process here at the commission. I want to begin by thanking the members of that task force. I think they did a great job. Notably, I think they did tremendous work really in helping us with the streamline process, and so we appreciate their efforts. The letter from the chair of that task force and the vice chair, Stephen Kaufman and Norman Coppinger, indicate that the task force members believe that at this point, the need for a task force has been met, that they've provided us with the input they wish to do, that additional areas of concern to members of the task force can be conducted through the normal channels of input that we have with stakeholders, and that at this point, we can end the task force. So that's what the letter, I think, accurately stated, summarized, says. Do any commissioners have any comments on the report from the task force? Do we have any public comment on the letter from the task force? All right, seeing none, I would move then that we formally terminate the enforcement task force and acknowledge and thank the members of the task force again for their great work in helping us with the enforcement processes, and particularly streamline.
A second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Yes.
The motion passes.
And one final point with respect to the enforcement task force. In their most recent letter, they proposed an idea which was to have periodic meetings where the commission members discuss enforcement priorities. I think that's a great idea, and that is certainly something that I intend to do in November. I think we're looking at having a special meeting public meeting where we will discuss enforcement priorities for the next year and invite, of course, members of the regulated community and other stakeholders to provide their input as we work towards doing that. So just wanted to give everybody a heads up about that. And again, thank you to the members of the task force. Moving to item 10. This is a pre-notice discussion of amendments to Regulation 18419. General Counsel Bainbridge and Senior Counsel Norton are presenting that for us. So, welcome.
Good morning, Chair Madich and Commissioners. I'm Zachary Norton, Senior Counsel with the Legal Division, and I'm presenting pre-notice discussion on sponsored committee regulation. So a recipient committee receives contributions to use for political purposes, such as making contributions or independent expenditures to support or oppose candidates and ballot measures, or making contributions to political parties and other state and local campaign committees. All recipient committees are required to file semi-annual statements for each half of the year, whether or not they've received any contributions or made any expenditures during the 6-month period covered by the statement. In 1977, the regulated community requested that the FPPC address the problem of redundant reporting. An organization, such as a labor union or trade association, that had established a separate bank account from which to receive and make political contributions, was required to report the same contributions and expenditures that its connected committee was required to report. The Commission decided to solve the problem by introducing the concept of a sponsored committee. If a sponsored committee engaged in political activity, then only the committee would have to report contributions and expenditures. The sponsoring organization would merely be identified in the committee's name, but would not have reporting obligations. The concept of sponsored committee was codified through legislation in 1985, and the Act's definition of sponsored committee is found in Section 82048.7. So moving on to current regulation. So the Act provides that every recipient committee file a statement of organization. The statement of organization must include, among other things, the name of the committee. And if the committee is a sponsored committee, the committee's name must include the name of its sponsor. Regulation 18419 contains certain requirements for sponsored committees. These requirements are threefold. First, the committee must include the sponsor's name in its name. Second, the sponsored committee must include on its statement of organization the industry or group affiliation of the sponsor. And third, the sponsor must itself file as a committee unless it fits within an exception created by the regulation. The proposed amendments would clarify when a committee qualifies as a sponsored committee and provide guidance as to how the sponsors must be identified in the name of the sponsored committee. The proposal provides a look-back period to be used when determining whether the 80% funding threshold has been met, and provides greater clarification regarding a use of the term that identifies an industry or other identifiable group when a committee has multiple sponsors. So as defined in Section 82048.7, a sponsored committee is a committee other than a controlled committee that has one or more sponsors. A sponsor is an entity, such as a business entity or organization, or trade association or labor organization that does one of the following. Provides 80% or more of the contributions received by the committee, either directly or from the entities or organization's members, officers, employees, or shareholders. Collects contributions for the committee through payroll deductions or dues. Provides all or nearly all of the administrative services for the committee, or sets the policies for soliciting contributions or making expenditures of committee funds. And note that this definition is included in both the statute and existing regulation. Proposed amended subdivision A2A states that for purposes of determining when a committee reached the 80% threshold for qualification as a sponsored committee, that threshold is determined based on all contributions received by a committee in the 24 months preceding. Currently, there is no such timing mechanism for calculating the 80% threshold. This could lead to committees, especially those that have existed for a long period of time, not accurately reflecting a present committee sponsor. The proposed amendments also state that a committee must determine if it is qualified as a sponsored committee or if a sponsor has changed at the time of the filing of each campaign statement. And this includes semi-annual, pre-election, and quarterly statements. Moving on to naming requirements. So a committee's name is one of the first pieces of information about a political committee that the public sees or hears. A committee's name appears on all the committee's mass mailings and in most advertisements, including television, radio, telephone, print, and email advertisements, informing the public of who sent or paid for the communication as required by the Act's Standard of Identification and Advertisement Disclosure provisions. Additionally, other electronic advertisements must also include a hyperlink to an internet website containing the committee's name. Section 84102 sets forth basic information that a committee's name must contain. It requires that a sponsored committee name include the name of the sponsor. One purpose of these provisions is to provide the public with a clear indication as to who is responsible for the committee and prevent entities which sponsor political committees from obscuring their identity behind the committee's name. These are consistent with the fundamental disclosure purposes of the Political Reform Act and the enhanced disclosure provisions of the recent California Disclose Act. When one or more organization that meets the definition of sponsor, Section 84102A provides that, quoting here, whenever a committee has one or more sponsor and the sponsors are members of an industry or other identifiable group, a term identifying that industry or group shall be included in the name of the committee. But the Act does not provide guidance regarding the appropriate terms which should be used to describe the industry or group affiliation of multiple sponsors. However, the multiple sponsor provision is an exception to the general rule that a specific name of the sponsor must be included. And for this reason, the identifying terms used for multiple sponsors should be as specific as possible. A term broader than necessary would not be consistent with the purposes of Section 84102A. The statute permits the use of a term identifying an industry or group. Proposed amended Subdivision B1 provides additional guidance regarding the appropriate terms which should be used to describe the industry or group affiliation of multiple sponsors. As proposed, the amendment defines the phrase other identifiable group as members of the same business or trade or nonprofit organizations with a common purpose, to make clear that any name used to describe multiple sponsors must accurately characterize the common business or nonprofit purposes of the sponsors. And additionally, non-exhaustive examples have been provided that include both sufficient and insufficient identification of multiple sponsors. The examples of names that do not sufficiently identify multiple sponsors are based off of problematic names identified by the Enforcement Division. And although such inadequate sponsored committee naming does not appear to be a widespread problem, we believe that these changes will help to prevent future naming problems. And then that there are a couple of other proposed revisions. These are just minor cleanup as noted. So,
Senior Counsel Norton, I have a question for you.
Yes.
I think you started to touch on this. You said this is not a major problem at this time?
We don't believe that it is. I've talked to enforcement, and there have been some instances of sponsored committees that have chosen names that seem to be rather vague and sort of obscure the true identity of the sponsor. But from what I can tell, most sponsored committees are sort of adhering to the underlying purposes of the naming requirements.
And with respect to becoming a sponsor, you become a sponsor by contributing to the committee above a certain threshold. Is that accurate?
Yes, there's the 4 different ways, so it...
Without getting into the particulars of it.
Yeah, yes.
So that's the basic gist of it.
Exactly.
As part of the disclaimer that would appear on these types of advertisements, you have the committee name, right? Which would
Yes.
include the identity of the sponsor under the current reg. But then, don't you also have specifically the identities of the top contributors to that committee? Currently, under current law.
I'm not... Does that?
Yes, you would.
Yeah.
So-
What I can't remember, whether this is new law or old law, is if it's named as a sponsor, if that's no longer requiring the top funder. But there might be someone in the room who's nodding his head yes that would remember that.
Mr. Lang, would you like to speak on this issue? And the question is simply whether or not the top contributors to a sponsored committee are already required to be disclosed as part of the disclaimer.
Yes, the top contributors, if it's a ballot measure independent expenditure committee, and they're one of the top 3 contributors of $50,000 or more, would have to be listed as a top funder, even if they are the sponsor itself. One other provision that the Disclose Act has regarding that is when it's a sponsored committee and there's a single sponsor, only the name of the sponsor is listed as a top contributor, not the full name of the committee, because that could obscure the true top contributor. What is the purpose of the act? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I find that interesting that just in terms of how great of a problem this is, what the need for this reg, it seems to me that the identities of the sponsors specifically are already required to be included in the disclaimer by virtue of their status as a top contributor. Did you think, was that something that staff took into consideration when they were crafting this reg?
Well,
In other words, what enhanced disclosure are we really gaining here if the names of the sponsors are already being disclosed as part of the disclaimer because they're a top contributor?
what you're eliminating is the sponsors that qualify potentially under one of the other categories, diluting the name that would be attributed to it. So if they hit the $50,000 threshold as the sponsor, yes, they would be the top contributor. That's not always the case that 80% of what is funding a committee is going to hit the $50,000 top contributor threshold.
So in your mind, the proposed changes would enhance disclosure with respect to the top contributor, well, to contributors who are below the $50,000 threshold?
Yes, and I think maybe you could draw a distinction between whether someone is sponsoring a committee or whether they're a top contributor to the committee. I think you could, if you're really paying close attention, sponsor has, in my mind, more control of the committee, and people who understand this know the sponsor is the person who is running the committee. The top contributor may just be the person giving the most money to the committee. So I think there's an aspect of control that goes along with sponsoring a committee that you don't get with the top funder disclosure.
All right, that's helpful.
And I'd point out too that since you can become a sponsor by providing administrative services or setting policies, it's a different way of controlling without necessarily being a top contributor.
Okay.
So in that respect, it would be a different disclosure.
All right, that's helpful. Do other commissioners have any comments on this proposed reg?
Good mind. Well, it may not be, in terms of volume, a lot. Continue to see what I consider to be very deceptive sponsored committee names that sort of prey on this statutory out that's other identifiable groups. And so a major business organization would name their committee, for instance, taxpayers and homeowners, but nothing to mention the name of the organization that puts more than 80% of the money into the committee and controls its expenditures. And that's the kind of thing that I think it may not be, in terms of volume of these things, there's enough of them that I think, especially around ballot measures, there's a lot of hiding behind euphemistic terms. And so I think clarity here that the staff has provided, I think, is very welcome, and as far as I'm concerned. If there are other things that don't seem clear, I think we would certainly want to resolve those as well. Let those concerns be expressed by themselves. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd had some questions for staff a couple of days ago regarding the possibility that a committee could be considered a sponsored committee under this reg when in fact there was no intent for it to be sponsored by the company that people just happen to give to. Now, I've since come to the realization that my problem is with the statute, not with this reg. I think the statute is a little nuts because I'd always understood sponsored committees to be the, political alter ego of a thing that's not a committee. So, and that was to address the duplicative reporting that existed before the sponsored committee was put into, before this this rule was put into place. because you did have double reporting. You had the entity reporting and then the entity's political alter ego, this committee reporting too. Well, we don't need that. But when you start talking about multiple sponsors, you start walking away from what was my very simple-minded, but I think clear understanding of what it meant to be a sponsored committee. You know, you're an alter ego of a thing. You're not an alter ego of 4 things. That's a recipient committee in my mind. It's a recipient committee that's got a particular niche or a bias or an attitude, but it's not, you know, I think it would be so much simpler if the statute was written the way I want it written. But that's not the world we live in. And so if people feel like this reg pushes disclosure in the right direction and makes things clearer, then yippee. But I'm having conceptual problem with how we got here to begin with, but that's just my problem. I'm sharing that all with you now, makes me feel better. But for the record, I don't really feel like, I almost feel like I don't have a dog in this fight because I don't think the statute makes a lot of sense. There you go.
Thank you, Commissioner.
To the chair, could I ask a question?
Of course.
Commissioner Hayward, do you think that the commission might want to consider sponsoring legislation in a future year that would deal with the statutory issues that you're concerned about?
I think that'd be great. I think it'd be very clarifying and simplifying, and I'm all for fewer laws that are clear and that are well enforced in general. That's just my predilection philosophically. And I think that would be pushing this in a better direction than the very sort of complicated, sort of meandering thing that we're looking at right now.
Commissioner Cardenas, do you have any comments?
Mr. Chair, I'm just wondering if there's a public comment or if there's an opportunity or if we might invite specifically stakeholders who may be in the audience to speak to this.
You read my mind. That's where I was going to go after our comments. So, all right. Why don't we go ahead and move to public comment on this item then? Is there any public comment?
Hi, Commissioners. Joe Gardarama from the board of the California Political Attorneys Association. I just want to report to you that our regulatory committee has met to discuss the proposed regulation. They opted to hear what you had to say during pre-notice discussion, and we'll be following up with written comments about what their opinions are, specifically with the examples of what does and what doesn't constitute a proper description of a sponsor. And I just want to do one clarifying point to something that was said earlier. General purpose committees are also required to report major funding, not just ballot measure committees and independent expenditure committees. So major funding is pervasive throughout campaign communications, and the chair is right. Sometimes you get the name of the sponsor in the committee name, and you get it again in the major funding language. So it just makes for very long disclaimers that no one reads.
Thank you. Do we have any other public comment on this item? Mr. Lang.
Trent Lang, California Clean Money Campaign, sponsor of the California Disclose Act. I think we welcome these clarifications. Commissioner Hayward is right. The underlying regulation is, the underlying code is imperfect and could be improved, and we would welcome the opportunity to work on that. But the name in sponsored committees is very important. Sometimes the sponsor is a top funder, will show up, but in many cases they are not. They will not show up. And we have seen cases, as Commissioner Hatch has raised, where they're using kind of general sounding names that are some of the sorts of examples that the regulation puts out that should be excluded. If it says Californian, Sacramento taxpayers, et cetera, that is not a real, in our view, description of who the sponsors are. Whereas the sorts of examples that they provide are more in that direction of a better description of it. So we would welcome that and look forward to engaging any further discussion. But we think this is a step in the right direction until the underlying code is improved.
Mr. Lang, I have a question for you. In
Yeah.
your experience, how often is it the case that a sponsor is not one of the top contributors?
It's quite often, just because, for instance, labor committees are very often sponsored. Committees are often sponsored by labor unions, and they do not typically have large $50,000 contributions. Their contributions are from their members that are giving under the threshold. So then their name as sponsor would only appear in the name of the committee. That is one example, and there are certainly a number of other examples.
Thank you.
Sure.
Darn it. Okay, I had a question in regards to the instances where the name of the sponsor and the top contributor are the same. That's required by the statute to repeat it in each instances. Do you think there's any merit in going back and revisit that statutorily so that if it's one and the same, they can just give the same name as sponsor and top contributor?
That's a great question. Possibly for radio ads where you actually would speak the name of the sponsor twice if they are a top contributor. I would say less so, in our opinion, on television ads, because the way the formatting of the disclosure on television ads, you have the paid for by and a super long committee name at the top. Sometimes there are 3-4 lines, as we've seen. Our anticipation is that in many cases voters will hopefully actually learn that that's not the interesting part. The interesting part are the top 3 funders that are in separate lines below, and on a television ad, they would just skip right down below that, or even on a print ad, they just skip right down below to where the top funders are, and they won't read the gobbledygook at the top so much on a television ad. But on a radio ad, where they have to read the committee name as well as the top funders, then yeah, there's some possible reason to look for clarifications of the code so you don't have to repeat in that particular case.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Additional public comment? Mr. Rios?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, here on behalf of Olson Hagel, just to identify some issues with the proposed regulation. First of all,
Sorry, before you begin, I think in the past we've asked folks to identify whether they're being paid by a particular client.
I'm not currently representing a client.
Thank you.
But we would agree with staff that, we don't see a substantial need or a substantial shortcoming in the existing rules. We believe that if there are existing industry groups that are not properly identifying themselves in the committee name, that is an enforceable violation of the existing rules. And so we don't see the need for further clarification of the regulation. If the commission does decide to pursue a regulation, there are some changes or there are some issues I'd like to point out with the existing draft. First of all, on page 1, the changes that begin on lines 9 and 10, the current draft of the regulation requires a committee to evaluate whether it's a sponsored committee every time it files a campaign report. We think that's a fairly burdensome requirement, and we would propose either that you move to a semi-annual check, because every committee is required at least to file semi-annual reports, or in the alternative, you could move to a quarterly system to make it consistent with the jurisdictional verification that committees are already required to engage in. So we think checking this every time there's a campaign report is not really very productive, because sometimes committees are filing campaign reports within 30 days of each other when there's pre-election reports. So we think changing the frequency with which a committee is required to verify its sponsorship would be an improvement in this regulation. Secondly, I'd like to call your attention on page 2, line 8, to the change where it says that if the sponsored committee has more than one sponsor and the sponsors are member of the same industry, striking the word "and," that language as it is currently, not as currently drafted, but in the current version of the regulation, mimics the statutory language. So this change in the regulation is contrary to the express language of the statute. So we don't think this change is within the statute, the regulatory power of the commission. So we would point out that that change should be that language should be consistent with the statute. Furthermore, we're on the changes that are specified on line that starts on line 2. Page 2, line 10, where it talks about what an other identifiable group is. It says that an other identifiable group means members of the same business or trade or nonprofit organizations with a common purpose. And we're uncertain what an organization or a nonprofit organization with a common purpose is. I would raise the circumstance of a labor union, for example. Labor unions represent members who work in a variety of different areas. They represent construction workers and teachers and firefighters. And so we're curious as to whether labor organizations have a common purpose in that they seek to better the working conditions and the wages of employees across the state. So we think that should be a common purpose. And if it's not a common purpose, we would want to know that either in the regulation or we'd want to have further clarification on that point. The concern is that if organizations such as labor unions that represent different workers aren't deemed to have a common purpose, then we're going to have to either identify them specifically in the name of the committee or reference their industry group, which would make the names of the committees impossibly long, which would, as a consequence, affect the disclaimer. If the name of the committee is unconscionably long, then so also is the disclaimer, and it just wouldn't be a workable rule. In fact, the exception would swallow the statutory rule at that point if that was what was required. So we really need to drill down on that point. The same is true for nurses and doctors, for example. If the organizations representing nurses and doctors get together, are they part of the same identifiable group, or do they have a common purpose? The American Cancer Society, the lung, endless examples of what does it mean for an organization to have a common purpose or to have the same business or trade. So we think that portion of the regulation needs substantial clarification, and the outcome is really important because that could really impact the disclaimers that are required. Finally, I would point out on line 11, it says, sponsors with no such common industry or other identifiable group must be separately identified. But the language is ambiguous as to whether a description of the industry or other identifiable group must be separately identified, or whether the actual name of the sponsor is required to be separately identified. Again, if it's the latter, that could have an effect that it results in unwieldy committee names. So, and finally, just to address some of the points that were raised earlier, we do think if legislation is pursued, or if there is, if additional changes are being pursued, that having a sponsor and a major funder repeated in the same disclaimer doesn't make any sense. What you're trying to do is give the public reasonable notice about who's behind the advertisement. And some of the rules and in the interpretive letters require committee names and sponsors to be identified multiple times in the disclaimer rules. So if the commission decides to pursue that issue, we do think that could be a change that actually results in helping limit some of the duplicative requirements for sponsorship identification.
Thank you.
Question? On the purpose issue you raised, why would you not think that it's the reason why you formed the committee in the first place, as opposed to their general purposes of collective bargaining, or whether or not they're for better health care, or, the purpose would seem obvious if the multiple sponsors get together and they form a committee and fund it to oppose or support a particular ballot measure, for instance. That's the common purpose.
Well, the regulation refers to the nonprofit organizations. It says nonprofit organizations with a common purpose. So I read that to mean that it's the underlying sponsors, the nonprofit organization sponsors, that have to have a common purpose rather than a common purpose in the particular committee.
I took it to mean if there's only where it's multiple sponsors. If it's a single sponsor, that issue is not present, correct?
If there's a single sponsor, you have to name the sponsor. It's not an issue. It's
Right.
Where we get into this problem is where there are multiple sponsors and what's a sufficient industry or identifiable group description.
Well, my sense is that we're looking for it to be as narrow as is consistent, so that people have some hope of being able to understand where this money's coming from, as opposed to an overly broad one, which sort of allows them to mask the source.
Any other commissioner questions? All right, thank you, Mr. Rios.
Mr. Chair, when is this coming back?
October.
October?
Right. I did, and either General Counsel Bainbridge or Senior Counsel Norton, feel free, whoever wants to field this one. I'm curious, though, where you have that situation that Mr. Rios described with multiple labor organizations, different types but similar purpose. I mean, where do you anticipate staff drawing the line there?
Well, I think even as Mr. Rios described it, if it's labor unions representing firefighters and teachers, I think that term is probably descriptive enough right there. I don't know.
So it could just be labor under those circumstances?
I don't know that just labor is specific enough, but
Yeah, I would say the focus of the statute is on the person, the sponsor. We want to identify them. We're not trying to identify what their cause is. We want to know who is doing this. So I think that's the distinction that you may have to draw, and we may still have to give advice on this. I'm not saying this is going to make it's clear in every situation. The examples of doctors and nurses, I think the first part of that, the industry, would cover those, and you could say healthcare workers or something to that effect. I think that is captured by the first part of it, which is the industry. The other identifiable groups, I think if you have many different people in different industries, I don't think the intent of the statute is to allow you to combine all of those and identify their common purpose as opposed to their identity.
Okay, so suppose instead of labor, you had Heart and Lung Association, American Cancer Society, and those two were sponsors. Is there a way to combine them because of their work and as nonprofits with similar? I mean, I'm just trying to. Where are we going to draw the line? It seems a little vague to me.
Sure.
Or
On
do they
that
have to
one,
be specifically identified under those circumstances? So each would have to be specifically named. You couldn't combine them. What's the intent?
well, nonprofits against cancer, heart cancer,
Heart,
lung
and
cancer, heart disease, I guess is.
yeah.
Hey, I'm giving advice on the spot here.
I'm curious how you would anticipate this playing out. And if we're struggling with this, what type of clarity have we really achieved here is really my question.
Well, but I also want to point out, it's an exception to the rule. So if it is unclear, the Cancer Society and Heart Association might as well, we feel like separately identifying each entity as a sponsor provides greater clarity. They may just choose to go that route. They don't have to come up with one sort of perfect term that encompasses both, so.
Okay.
And
Sorry, Senior Counsel Norton, is what you just said, that your view is that this is an exception to a general rule, and therefore, in your mind, it has to be, part of the point here is that we have to narrowly construe that exception, and that's part of the intent behind this, right?
I think so. I think it does need to be, since it's an exception, it should be construed somewhat narrowly. So that's kind of what we're trying to do here.
Okay. General Counsel Bainbridge, do you have a comment?
And It's providing some clarity. It's not providing perfect clarity. You can always come up with scenarios where it's going to be hard to say if it meets this other identifiable groups. I think we're lessening that, and I think doing this will prevent the obvious abuses where people are creating wide groups of sponsors in order to obscure who's really behind a committee. And that's what we're trying to address here.
Okay. All right. Additional public comment?
Sorry. Since you asked, Richard Rios from Olson Hagel, since you asked for the specific examples, Mr. Chair, I also wanted to get clarity on the point, if, three healthcare organizations get together with a chamber of commerce where they aren't part of the same industry, how would you be required to identify the chamber? Would you have to name them specifically, or could you also include an industry identifier for those groups? For example, could you say healthcare organizations and business associations, or would you have to say healthcare organizations and the Chamber of Commerce?
Well, I think under that specific example, if it's a Chamber of Commerce, I think healthcare organizations and the Chamber of Commerce would probably be the appropriate designation. I don't know.
And what if it's multiple business organizations like the Chamber and the Business Roundtable and other organizations, healthcare organizations? Could you then utilize the industry group descriptions for both entities?
I'm thinking possibly for both, but coming up with one term that sort of encompasses that type of sort of broader coalition, I think is problematic. And I think that, as Commissioner Hatch pointed out, that sponsored by something that includes just taxpayers, I think that's when you get to these terms that are just so general that they become sort of meaningless in the sense that they don't convey information that's useful for the voters. So.
All right. Thank you.
Can I just add one thing before we move on?
Please.
Or if we're not, any comment that anybody has out there, we appreciate it in writing. And for purposes of sending the reg over in draft form to the Office of Administrative Law, the deadline is mid-September. I don't have the exact date, but to the extent you can get us information before then, it's helpful because we can incorporate it into our draft that goes over to OAL. The draft doesn't have to be exact that goes over to OAL, but if there's new concepts, those would need to be incorporated. So to the extent we can get comment before mid-September, we'd really appreciate it, and stuff in writing is always a lot easier.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's a good reminder. I do think to the extent folks have concerns about this, they are highly encouraged to submit them in writing so that we can take them into account. And I imagine that this is a matter that would come before Law and Policy, perhaps in September, once we have an updated reg. All right. Thank you both very much. Appreciate your work on this.
Thank you.
All right, let's go ahead and move to the next item. Why don't we go ahead and do this now? So we're going to move to item 11. This is a discussion of remote participation in meetings by members of the public. This is a matter that we had asked staff to previously examine what technological, fiscal, and other considerations are at play if we wanted to provide additional ways for the public to offer public comment during our meetings. And so I think what I would like to do, if staff is ready, they've been hard at work on this, and they have a demonstration for us of one type of technology that would allow the public, and I think I'm getting this right, to provide text comments essentially in real time with very minor 15-second delay for each item as we're going through the items at our meetings. So,
good morning. My name is Jesse Hidalgo. I am an IT specialist for the FPPC. We have been tasked, the IT department's been tasked with increasing communication between the public and the commission. And one of our team members, Amanda French, came up with a solution. We've implemented that solution in a sort of quickly fashioned manner, so it's not entirely, finished product. But we are ready to show you guys this today. What we are basically doing is allowing for comments to be made live based on the video, but in a controlled sense. So Amanda's bringing up some laptops for you guys to look at the demonstration. And then Elwin, go ahead and bring it up. You can see over here on both of the screens that the live view is of the current video, it's happening right now. It's a Spaceballs thing. And then if you scroll down, you can see that each item is listed. And if somebody wants to make a public comment on those items, they would just have to click on it and it would show up underneath. They can make that comment. All they would need to do to make that comment is give their name, and then they could make that comment.
And just to make sure the commissioners are seeing exactly what's up on the screen over here?
Yeah, so the commissioners are actually seeing the website themselves, so they can control and click on any of it. Yeah, so as Chair Mattis has said, it's about a 15 to 30 second delay. We timed it earlier today, and it was about 25 seconds. So there is a delay, but it's not terribly long. So we built this whole site in-house with everything that we own, so we didn't have to purchase any new products for it. Since we are in-house, we are able to improve upon it as we need to. So like engineers usually say, make it work, step one, make it work better, step two. We're at the make it work section of it. So improvements can come based on, just playing with it for a little bit. But this would allow public comments to be made beforehand and then read by you guys in live time. And then the administrator can turn comments off after the item's over with. So we can turn off comments to be made on items 1 through 10 already for this meeting in particular, but keep 11 through whatever it is open for the rest of the, until they're done. So this is the text-based version of increasing communication, and we built this in-house. So as other requirements come along, we feel like we can improve a single location. And the reason why I'm bringing all that up is we looked at other applications to solve these problems, and a lot of them did a lot of good things right. But this one, we feel like can be customized to our needs as you guys see fit. So.
Thank you very much. This is impressive that you guys were able to do this in just a month ago when we made the ask, so appreciate it.
Yeah, and we showed you yesterday, and you had asked to be able to turn off the video for you guys. What we did is we made it so that the video is now always, so it doesn't have to reload, so you can turn it off yourselves, and then now just look at the comments.
Goes up in the corner.
Yeah.
We can turn it off.
Yeah, yep. And that would be, yeah, so now you're just viewing the comments, and then it'll never have to refresh even though you click on an item. So that's how quickly we can change the application based on, a concern that you might have. They did it this morning, so.
All right, thank you. Do you have a commissioner
Question?
comments?
Yeah, thank you. As people are sending in texts on a particular subject area, your system would sort it out in terms of which one gets posted, or you see them actually typing it, or is it just pop up?
No, it would be, you type it out, you hit, place comment, and then it would move that comment to the top of the list and then move.
First come, first served.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the earlier ones would go lower, and
Oh,
the
I see.
newer ones will pop up at the top.
Okay.
Yeah.
If it's a handful of comments, it seems good, but what if there's a sort of a organized effort to put hundreds on? at the
So
same time?
there's anti-spamming. So if one user has decided to copy paste, the anti-spam will immediately lock that user out of commenting.
Okay.
And then there's also ways to tag words that would, if it's a curse word or something like that, we can make it gibberish or something like that, so it's more appropriate for a display on.
Okay, and so like if they use bots to actually submit things on a lot of other sites, would you have something that's requires that you identify you're not a bot? Or-
We can do that. We don't have it set up like that right now, and that's something that we're going to have to determine how we want to do it. Basically, the way you either do it is you either go all in on verifying people as users, or you open it up to everyone. Right now, we have it opened up. You just require a name. We can lock it down to a point where you have to verify they're human. We can have them log in with a social media account or something like that. But that's basically you're gonna have to decide how you want it to work.
Right, but in terms of the I'm not a bot kind of a thing, that's something you can do without them having to identify who they are, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I don't think by law, we're able to require that they tell us who they are, correct? Okay.
Additional commissioner comments?
So I'm just trying to think this through logistically. So for me to take advantage of this, I would have my laptop here, and I would see the comments as they come in, and the other commenters are going to see the comments that come in. It's like looking at like a Twitter
Sure, yeah.
comments or something like that. I think it'd be really interesting. I don't know how big an audience we'll get, but yeah, I want to try it out and see what happens.
Yeah,
and we may have to come up with additional filters and things as we go along. There may be one memorable meeting in our future where things go really kind of interestingly, but I think it would be really nice to be sitting here, maybe getting testimony from the public or prattling on like I do and have a comment coming up and saying, no, you're wrong and this is why. And be like, oh, that would be very helpful. So, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I just want the record to reflect that this technology clearly adds at least 15 pounds I just want everyone to know that's what's going on.
That's not what you're going to look like.
Well, thank you. Do we have any public comment on this item at this time? All right. Commissioner Hatch.
Yeah. I'm impressed that you're on such short notice of being able to come with what seems to be initially a workable solution. And my thanks to you.
So in addition to the presentation that IT staff just did for us with this technology, this item includes several memos from staff. One of those memos identifies what I think is an important and related need for the commission to consider, which is whether or not we ought to establish rules for public participation. Many state agencies do that. Many of them post them online on their websites. Others adopt them in formal regulations. It seems to me that we ought to, as part of this, a separate but related part of this, direct staff to come back to us with some draft rules for public participation. Both, though, I think that would benefit us both when we have in-person public comment, but then also with this new technology. So I don't know how commissioners feel about that issue.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I think FPPC has had like conventions about, please limit your testimony to 3 minutes unless you're asked questions and stuff like that. But I don't think they've ever been, put down in black and white. And I think that's what the statute requires, is that we have it written down and we have it enacted with a vote and the whole big thing. And so I think that's important because I think that the fact that it has been just a convention is probably not how we should have been doing things.
Any other commission comment on that particular issue?
And in that regard, I would think that we'd want to be able to limit, for instance, the length of a text so that someone just doesn't download the 75-page treatise as a part of their comment. Well, it might be interesting. There are other ways that they can get that to us, and it would just distract from the purpose of it is to have brief comments. So likewise, as we limit the verbal testimony, we should set some standard as to the length of the comments. And maybe even technologically, I'm sure you can figure out a way to prevent people from pasting comments in as opposed to.
Yeah, we definitely can limit the text. And I'm not sure about the pacing capabilities, but we can limit the text to a character limit.
Thank you.
All right, is there any additional public comment at this time on this matter? All right, if not, then I have two motions. The first motion is that I would like for the commission to authorize staff to, on a pilot basis, beginning at the next commission meeting, roll out the additional public participation methodology that we demoed here today, whereby people can send in text-based comments through the website.
Second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Aye.
Chair Matich?
Yes.
The motion passes.
The second motion is that we direct staff to develop draft rules for public participation for the commission to consider at the next commission meeting, with the additional direction, more specifically, that those rules cover both in-person public testimony and public comment through the new digital methodology that we just authorized.
Second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Chair, just for clarification, in drafting the rules for both in-person and remote participation, is that a direction to, as much as possible, have them be, the same exact set of rules? I mean, obviously, time versus text, we'd have to distinguish, but beyond that, it would be the same?
At this point, our direction is for staff to develop what I think essentially would be best practices for us to consider at the next meeting. And if we, as a commission, think there are reasons to deviate or vary between the different methodologies, we can discuss it next month. But we're really looking for you guys to give us your best advice on what the best practices are.
Question? If it's contemplated that there would be comments from, or there could be comments from the commission to comments that we receive in close to real time online. In other words, are we contemplating that we receive a comment online and then one of us comments, a public comment, as we often do when someone is presently here, and we comment to what has just been posted? Do we then need to, for the record, recite the entirety of what the written transmitted comment was?
To my mind, that would be one area for staff to consider what would be the most appropriate way for us to deal with that circumstance.
I think it'd be helpful to, in some way, number them or something so that we can refer to them by, comment number or however, so that we don't have to repeat the gist of it to be able to comment on it.
Yeah, we can look into adding numbers.
And this anticipates that the comments would all become part of the public record after the fact. So I think numbering would be a good shorthand way to reference a specific comment, because the comment does need to be part of the public record, so.
All right. Thank you guys very much. Great work on this. All right, moving to item 12. This is the Commission's fiscal year 2019-2020 annual budget report. Chief of Admin and Technology, Han, welcome to the table.
Oh, we don't get to keep it?
Good afternoon, Chair and Commissioner. This This memo is to provide you staff proposal on the budget allocation by category. This estimate was developed by considering the past spending. Staff is seeking approval of the proposed budget allocation for fiscal year 1920. I'm happy to answer any question you may have on this topic.
Any commissioner comments?
A question. I read the item, and I think I appreciate it in the future presentations that we had a second column for the comparable for the previous year. So we just get a sense of perspective as we're looking at it. Is this an increase or decrease, or is it the same, that kind of thing?
Based on your request, so I did prepare something, but I didn't have enough time to upload on the website yet, which I will do after the meeting.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Thank you.
And for the public, what's been passed out is what was presented at the commission meeting a year ago as last year's budget in comparison to this year's budget.
Thank you, that's exactly what I was looking for.
Any additional commissioner comment on this item? All right, is there any public comment on this item? All right. Thank you very much, Ms. Han. Moving to item 13, this is a staff report back to the commission at the request of Commissioner Hayward to provide some background information on the legal rules with respect to behested payments. So I see the Commission Counsel O'Connor, and welcome to the table.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Ryan O'Connor, Commission Counsel, and as you said, I'm presenting on item 13, BS payments discussion. The Act regulates 3 categories of payments for an elected officer: contributions, gifts, and BS payments. These categories determine how a payment is reported and what, if any, limits apply. Generally, a contribution is a reportable payment made for political purposes, for which a donor does not receive full and adequate value in exchange. Contributions are subject to limits depending on the office sought. A gift is a payment that confers a personal benefit to the extent that equal or greater value is not exchanged. Some gifts are reportable on an official statement of economic interest if the value of the gift is $50 or greater. Additionally, reportable gifts to officials are capped at $500 in value. ABS payment is a payment made to a third party requested by an elected officer that is neither a contribution nor a gift. The only BS payments deemed reportable are those behested by an elected officer for a legislative, charitable, or governmental purpose in which full and adequate consideration is not exchanged. Payments from the same source in the same calendar year aggregating to the $5,000 threshold are reportable but not subject to limits. Earlier this year, the Enforcement Division received a complaint alleging that the Lieutenant Governor reported BS payments to an organization for funds that should have been classified as either contributions or gifts. The organization used the payments to fund the Lieutenant Governor's inauguration and furnish her office at the Capitol, including chairs, desks, conference room furniture, picture frames, and artwork. The Enforcement Division did not open an investigation in response to the complaint, citing insufficient evidence of a violation of the Act. Payments to furnish an office appear to fall under the presumption that they were unrelated to an officer seeking or holding of elective office because the payments were either made principally for the governmental purpose of facilitating the state's business or for the personal benefit of the elected officer. Accordingly, the Act does not support a finding, that the payments constitute contributions to the behesting officer. The salient issue is whether the payments conferred a personal benefit to the behesting officer or the payments were made principally for a governmental purpose. Historically, staff has said that it is possible that a gift or loan of artwork could confer a personal benefit on a particular official, although staff has also said that surplus inauguration funds spent by a 501c4 to cover a mayor's office transition expenses were reportable BS payments that serve a governmental purpose. Prior to the legislature carving out BS payments from contributions, staff also advised that a house purchase for the use of a former governor was permissible under the act. Staff deemed that by the third party providing the house and the furnishings to the governor, it conferred a gift to the state rather than a gift to the governor himself. If the commission determines the purchase of furnishings for government offices at an elected officer's request should not fall within the definition of a BS payment, it should consider whether such payments constitute gifts or contributions. Defining such payments as a contribution would require a statutory change. If gifts, the commission could adopt a regulation clarifying when items of this nature principally confer a personal benefit on the officer. Staff could draft a regulation distinguishing between personal items and those ordinary and necessary for the particular office. For instance, staff could draw this distinction based on the value of the item, the inherent nature of the item, or any guidelines the commission has in mind. With that said, I welcome any discussion addressing this issue and any further potential BS payments regulation.
Thank you, Council O'Connor. I had a question for you. So the behested payments with respect to the Lieutenant Governor's office, those were publicly disclosed. Is that correct?
That is correct. So with behested payments, the issue is not disclosure. Everything does get captured over the $5,000 threshold. The issue would be that there are no caps, there are no limits to the amount that can be requested or behested.
All right. And enforcement concluded that there was no violation of the act under these circumstances. Is that right?
That is correct.
And if we wanted to change.
Can I just, a slight distinction that I know she's going to tell me about if I don't say. They rejected the complaint, finding there was no basis to pursue an investigation at that point. They didn't make a finding one way or the other.
All right. Thank you for the clarification. To the extent that the behested payments at issue here that were publicly disclosed, that there was some feeling that we wanted to change that policy, that's actually something that the legislature would need to do, correct?
Correct. If you want to go the route.
Payments.
Yes, it is, because the legislature initially put BS payments into the act, and now it's currently in 4 different statutes.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Other commissioner comments?
Question. I think, as I recall in the analysis, that there's a distinction between taking behested payments and spending them on the office as opposed to the person. But yet we don't, it's not clear in our regulations. I think, unless I've missed something, there may be an opportunity to, without violating any statutes, to provide some clarity as to how those are spent, or so that it's a brighter line as to which. So in other words, if you say, we want to build a house for a governor's mansion for the state of California, for the office of governor, that's different than saying, I want Joe Blow to have this house while he's governor. Am I making myself clear?
Yes, just for further clarification, I was wondering if you're talking about payments that were behested initially as a prerequisite, or just payments that were just, volitionally given to either the state or
in each of the
earmarked.
cases, the elected official behested payments to a nonprofit, and then for a purpose, and the purpose in some cases was for the office of something. In other words, all future governors, or, in other cases, it's just for a particular, in other words, the example I think you gave was art that could become a gift if it's just for that particular office holder. And so I was thinking perhaps we might consider a regulation that would provide some clarity as to the differences and how that would affect whether it's behested or a gift.
The analysis really is whether it's to the office or to the individual. I think is often a distinction without a difference. It's whether it's of a personal nature. The item that's being given is of a personal nature. So what we would do is define by a regulation what that means. Specifically, could be done in the context of items that are provided to you for use in your office, but maybe could be considered to have a personal nature, such as artwork.
I see. Well, like for instance, in the office furniture kind of a example, if the gift intention was to furnish that office and that the furniture disappear after that office holder leaves, that's different than if it's becomes the property of the state on behalf of all future and present governors.
Certainly, if it is given to the person and they use it in their office and take it with them when they
Becomes
leave
a gift.
office, that's a gift.
Maybe impermissible gift. So it would be nice to maybe see some clarity of where those fall. Maybe it's not possible, but I would like for you to consider that.
Can I ask you a question? That circumstance that Commissioner Hatch just described, isn't that already embraced within the regs? I mean, isn't that distinction already clear enough? Like if instead of conferring a benefit on the office as a whole, for example, for future holders of that office to use as opposed to something personal, isn't that already covered?
Yeah, that would be a gift if it is given to the person to keep.
Right.
As opposed to use while they're in office.
Right. All right.
Yeah, thank you for the memo. I think, in my mind, under the existing rules, the behesting of payments to a 501c4 so you can decorate your office is clearly not charitable. I don't really think it's governmental. I think it's a gift. I know the Duke Machin precedent is a little problematic. It's not clear to me what role he had in soliciting those funds. This is excess inaugural funds, but, I'm not sure that under what we now understand to be a bequest, whatever. I'm not sure what his role was personally, and I think that's kind of an important aspect if we're looking at this now is soliciting a gift. And then also, that's kind of a weird precedent just because, as I recall, now I didn't look this up, so my recollection may not be quite right. The governor's mansion at that time was would have been hard for a person to live in. I don't think it had been residence for a while when Duke Machin was elected. The Reagans didn't live there. And, it was in what at the time was kind of a shady part of town. And I think the notion was that the governor would be happier, healthier, and safer in Fair Oaks or wherever it is they ended up putting the house. I don't remember now exactly. So I think that's kind of a one-off. The lieutenant governor has an office with furniture provided by the state. She doesn't need to go get one because the office has been occupied by squatters or all the furniture was destroyed in a flood or, something like that. She's already got one. She just wants a nicer one for her. And I don't get the governmental rationale there. Even were the state to take ownership of the nice furniture at the close of her tenure, it's particular to her and not maybe something that the state really wants. So I see gift all over this. But if we need to make it clear so everyone sees gift besides just me, then I'm happy to move that direction.
I have a question actually for staff because there are some factual assumptions there that I just want to check. Do we know what the nature of that furniture was? Was it nice furniture, so to speak, or was it simply state-type issued furniture, number one? And number two, are we even sure that there was an existing budget item for that? Or was the fact that there was a lack of budgetary appropriation for office furniture the driver behind the request to have the behest used for furniture? Do we know?
I do not know the specifics of the actual items that were purchased. I do know the value amount, and I do know that there was some allocation made for certain items that was insufficient. And I believe these payments were above and beyond what was given, what was allocated originally by the Lieutenant Governor.
Can we unpack that for a second? So you said that there was an allocation, but the allocation was insufficient. And so the behested payments were used to essentially fill the gap with the lacking appropriation. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yes, I believe that is correct.
So in a sense, the behested payments were one way of looking at it is the behested payments were used to purchase items that there wasn't allocated public funds for. So in a sense, they were, I mean, you could look at it and say it was saving the taxpayer money, I suppose.
That is correct.
I don't think the taxpayers really needed to be on the hook for over $300,000 in office furniture and decor. I don't think that would have ever been a reasonable thing to budget. And I think it's particularly personal, and so like I say, I see gift all over this, but your mileage may vary.
Is there any way for staff to, I think there's a factual question in my mind, whether, I think one impression is that there's all this fancy furniture out there that essentially other office holders would not have otherwise gotten but for this behested payment. I think there's another perspective, maybe that the appropriation didn't provide enough furniture to staff the office properly, and therefore the behested payment was used for that. Is there any way to resolve that factual issue?
Sounds more like an investigation than,
We
we could
don't
look,
have anything in the record currently.
we could look what's in the record, yeah. But I think the record is basically what has been reported as behested payments, and then the complaint that was sent to the Enforcement Division, and then the response from council.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Correct me if I'm wrong, the guidance that we've given in the past has been in the form of advice letters, correct? It's not like we have black letter regulations that tell what is and what is not for guidance for future endeavors.
There's many pages of what is and isn't a gift, but not in this specific context where you're talking about office furniture that's been behested.
Thank you.
All right, any additional commissioner comments?
Yes, Chair, Mr. Chair, thanks. Well, there is at least the one advice letter that deals with artwork. It's referenced here in the staff memo. Is it Frederick advice letter? So presumably, that's not before us, but presumably the Frederick advice letter rests on its face, purports to rest on solid precedential foundation, which may well provide at a minimum guidance for us in making the same determination as to what are factors which ought to be in the mix or have already been deemed to be in the mix by virtue of prior analysis when determining what constitutes a personal benefit. Also, if I might, with respect to a recent comment about representation by staff, I did not understand staff to suggest that the appropriation for the office read the physical structural office of the current holder of the office of the Lieutenant Governor, that the appropriation for that particular year was lacking. What I understood was that it was deemed by somebody to be, and I believe the word you used, sir, was insufficient. So I didn't understand that to mean that there was no money appropriated for furniture, therefore let us find another way. But rather that somebody, perhaps the office holder, determined that the amount of money that had been, perhaps prior to her election, set aside for new furniture for either because it was the end of a 5-year term where the furniture is, typically in government offices, they're replaced hopefully, at some schedule, or perhaps whenever there is a physical turnover in the office. The impression that I got, and maybe you can correct me, is that somebody, perhaps the office holder, deemed that a budgeted and appropriated amount was not sufficient for a personal taste for the office. And to the extent that that's the case, I agree with Commissioner Hayward. That sure smells, sounds, and if I were to see it, may very well look like a personal benefit. That wasn't rhetorical. What's the?
No, that was accurate. Everything you said was accurate. I mean, I'm reiterating from sources from which I've researched. But yes, everything you summarized coming from my mouth was accurate.
Is there any public comment on this matter? All right. Any additional commissioner comments? All right. Thank you very much, Mr. O'Connor.
Thank you. Wait a minute, what are we doing here? Is this going to come back, or what?
There was no motion made.
Well, what's before us? Was it just to
There's a
talk about
report
it?
from staff to provide information.
I would like to make a motion that staff come back to us with regulatory language that parses a little more distinctly the personal benefit issue that I think is troubling at least two of us.
Second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
No.
The motion passes.
Can I get some clarification? Is this something that we're going to add to the ever-growing list of regulations for next year, or is there some more, is this something we should prioritize?
Well, I think that's a discussion I'd like to have later in the year. I mean, my personal opinion on that, there was a news article about something that was properly reported that staff did not pursue as a violation of the act. I think that's a fair enough characterization of it. There are disputed facts. Folks have speculated as to the nature of the purchase, the need for the purchase, et cetera. I don't see staff coming to us and asking us to do anything. I think this is perhaps a solution in search of a problem. So I would not prioritize it. No, I think we can have that discussion later in the year.
Mr. Chairman, would it benefit the commission to have a broader understanding of how many times this, how many disclosures we receive, how many times people ask for advice on this, and sort of the various areas where this plays out?
I think that'd be helpful. What do other folks think?
As long as you don't have to increase your workload tremendously to provide that information.
No, that's known and knowable right now.
Okay.
You know, the exact number of times we get requests for advice and the exact number of times we get disclosures on this.
As one who voted for the motion, I tend to concur with the chair as to not pushing this in front of other measures that will be coming before the commission in terms of regulatory calendar. And it's something that could be sorted out in a regulatory calendar meeting.
For my part, I think that background would be very helpful. I think it would start to suggest the contours of what a more specific rule would look like. And as far as the urgency, all I can say about that is that once people see that this can be done, they will want to do it too. And so, maybe it's not urgent, maybe, it's not, wildfire type, national emergency, but if we're going to tighten this up, and I think we should, again, because I see gift all over this, then maybe just talking about it today is enough to send a signal that, don't you all get all crazy about asking your friends in the political world for money so that you can decorate your office. Or maybe, other things that are even, more personal in character. You need an entourage. I don't know. But I do know that bad ideas like this can, run around the block before the good guys get started. And I would really like to not see this blow up. So as far as timing goes, that's what I think.
On another matter relating to this, I'm not looking to relitigate the past actions, whether it be Governor Duke-Majan or the current treasurer. What I am looking to do is provide future guidance for future considerations, just to make it clearer so that those who might consider what they're going to do would be able to do that so without maybe getting in trouble or not do it at all.
Right. For my part, my concern is prospective, moving forward. As for the urgency, I defer to the chair in his judgment. And 10 are finely tuned on this, I believe, as they ought to be.
Is that sufficiently clear, Mr. Bainbridge?
Yeah, that works. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
And just so I understand it, we will return next month with that information as to how often this comes up. understanding that the commission, upon hearing that, may want to push this to the front of the queue for regulations.
I would not actually say that we need that next month. I think what we talked about is taking it up as part of the regular discussion about the regulatory calendar. So perhaps we take it up at that time.
Okay.
All right, moving to item 14. This is the local jurisdiction contract update, Executive Director Jones and Senior Counsel Harrison.
Thank you. I've asked Commission Counsel Karen Harrison to join me up here because she really is responsible in large part for the very hard and good work that went into both the San Bernardino contract that the Commission approved last month, as well as the template contract that, upon the Commission's approval, we plan on offering to all localities. To date, we've gotten now 7 inquiries from localities wanting to enter into contracts for various parts of their compliance with the PRA. We met with Sacramento, requested a meeting. We met with them yesterday. The Commission may remember that they had been subject to a contract, but now they're looking to renew the contract under the template. And we will be visiting with their Ethics Commission next Monday, the following Monday, to discuss with them how we can better service their needs under the new contract. So the contract has been before this commission last month, and it's passed through the committees. This is virtually identical to the San Bernardino contract. The salient differences are the commission probably noticed that there's a la carte menu up front where the localities can choose what type of service they would like our office to perform for them. This will allow us to better budget in advance for what services we're going to be performing on their behalf. We do think that the audit function is what we're hearing most people are interested in right now, and so we are taking steps to kind of gear that up. We do have one position that was posted for an auditor that has, we've now gotten all the resumes in, and the application process is closed on that. And we're looking into adding another auditor in the near future, assuming, of course, that the commission accepts this contract as something that we should move forward on. So thank you again to Counsel Karen Harrison, and look forward to the commission's input.
Motion?
Well, is there any commission comment on this?
No, I've gotten a look at several drafts of this, and I'm very pleased with it.
All right. Is there any public comment on this item? All right. Do we have a motion?
Mr. Chair, I move for approval of the template contract for use for all future local government contracts.
Second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Matich?
Yes.
The motion passes.
Thank you, Executive Director Jones and Counsel Harrison. It's great work. All right, moving to item 15. These are the various committee reports. Why don't we start with the committee or budget committee?
Yeah. Budget and Personnel met via telephone. We looked at the budget document that you've seen in your binder today. We also looked at the draft contract, which you've also seen today. And we talked offline about some personnel matters, and it was fun.
Thank you. Commissioner Hatch, do you want to report on law and policy?
Just simply that the Law and Policy Committee did also review the contract, the template contract, and also received updates on the various statuses of the various bills. I think there's nothing unique to report except that we would wait until the legislative update on the status of the actual individual bills. And there have been some changes even since our meeting. So thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, let's go ahead and move then to item 16. This is our legislative update. Welcome back, Mr. Ung.
Thank you, Chair Matich. It's good to be back with the living.
Yes.
Bar prep is not fun. Before I start, the first thing I want to mention is just a big thank you to Council Bainbridge and Jay Warianga, who covered for me during my 2-month leave of absence. The FPPC family really stepped up and covered for me during my leave of absence. And the second thing, I think I just want to quickly go over the legislative calendar for the next month, just to provide context to the commissioners as you're making decisions today as to what to expect. The legislature has returned from their summer recess and they have 1 month left in their session. The session concludes September 13th. The last day to amend any political reform act bill because of the 12-day waiting period is August 30th. And so this will be the last regular commission meeting in which you will take actions on bills prior to the end of session. And then after that, any actions you take in September will essentially be communicating to the governor's office directly. And in that context, I'm happy to jump into the legislative report prepared by Mr. Bainbridge and Mr. Warianga. For the sake of time, I think I just want to focus on the bills that we've seen some substantive changes to since the notice or since your last meeting. Is that okay, Mr. Chair?
Yes, please.
From your report, we'll start with Assembly Bill 201, and I am going to hand Ms. Linker a number of packets to hand out. So thank you to her. And for the record, for the public, sorry. The document that's being handed out are copies of the bills as they are amended today. And so you can read those bills at leginfo.ca.gov. So you should receive copies of bills for 201, 964, 902, and 1217. Should be 4 bills.
Mr. Young, I have a question, a clarification.
Absolutely, Mr. Chair.
The version of Assembly Bill 201 that I was just handed has blue additions and red strikeouts.
That's
And my
correct.
question is, are those all indicative of changes that were made as part of the August 12th amendments?
It is, yes. All of the versions you're looking at are the changes made in the most recent amendments, not the changes that will be made to existing law.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So I'd like to start with Assembly Bill 201, which is the text messaging bill. This bill received a number of amendments on August 12th. I think for the sake of this conversation, I'm just going to raise what staff has flagged as the biggest changes for your discussion, and then happy to take direction on where you want to go from there. In Section 1 of the bill, which is on page 2 of the copy that you have, for Section 84502, they've added an additional form of disclaimer, which is in addition to paid for by or add paid for by, they've added the possibility of somebody disclaiming through the use of with. The example we were given by the legislative office is when you send a text message, you would say, "Hi, this is Philip with for assembly," and that would be the disclaimer that they could use in the campaign. Another set of changes that you'll see on page 3 is there are a couple of sections now that go into quite a number of detail of how common usage and parlance of shorthand can be used. They decided to put this in the bill rather than leave it to the commission to do through statute. It is the prerogative of the legislature if they wish to do that. The one thing that I would point out in a future amendment under small b2, in that section on the top of page 3 is the author has indicated that in paragraph 2 they will be amending the section that says first and last name of the candidate to just say name of the candidate. So that will be an amendment that will occur after this commission meeting at some point in the future. Moving down now on towards the bottom of page 3, under subdivision small c, there was a big change here in paragraph 2 where it says that an unpaid volunteer, and we've quibbled with the term unpaid volunteer. It's just something Legislative Council did. There's no such thing as a paid volunteer, but it is something that Legislative Council put in there. But that an unpaid volunteer that sends text messages with the assistance of mass distribution technology does not need to include the top 2 contributors in that text message. So it would just be the regular paid for by or with if they're using mass distribution technology. And those are the big changes that staff has highlighted to bring to your attention. We think there are a number of places, if this bill was to pass in this form, where regulation would need to be adopted to further specify some direction in regards to what text would need to be hyperlinked, if they were going to be hyperlinked, and other interpretive matters. So happy to take any questions.
In defense of the Ledge Council, there are areas of existing law that refer to paid volunteers, and it's typically a per diem type of a payment that they receive.
Got it.
Actually, if you look at volunteer firefighters, for instance, there is such thing as a paid volunteer and an unpaid volunteer.
I appreciate that context. It's the first time I've heard that, but yes, that's much appreciated.
I had a few questions for you. The first question is, what is the purpose of adding the or with option as opposed to sticking with paid for by? It seems, paid for by seems very clear to me. It's a clear signal to voters of who's paying for something. With is pretty ambiguous. So what is the purpose of that?
The purpose that was provided to me by the author's office is the medium of the communication text messages. The nature of it, they say, is supposed to be conversational. And that by allowing a with disclaimer, it retains the medium and the purpose of that medium better than calling out add paid for by or paid for by. That's a matter that the staff discussed internally is generally what's the purpose of these disclaimers? Is it to simply provide information to voters so they can identify where the message is coming from, or to provide information to voters so they know that the communication is a paid communication? And we concluded that that's a policy decision left to the commission on what they believe, what you believe is the best use or the purpose of a disclaimer on an advertisement.
What's the typical purpose of a disclaimer? Is it not to identify who's paying for the communication and who is behind the communication, essentially?
That has been the case, yes, for all other mediums.
Okay. All right. I had another question, and that is skipping down to it's C2. So as I understand this, if these types of committees use an unpaid volunteer to send the text message using Tosker, for example, that they would not have to identify the top 2 contributors. Why? What's the purpose of that?
To tell you the truth, I'm not sure the reason why, or at least the reason they gave me, I didn't think was a very good reason. They essentially said volunteers using mass distribution technology they're not sophisticated players, right? They are volunteers. My response was, they're using mass distribution technology. They're clicking a button, it's sending these messages, not en masse, but they're preloaded messages. These aren't individual messages that are being typed out by volunteers, which is covered by paragraph 1. And so why they can't put the top 2 in, I'm not 100% sure, other than perhaps putting the top 2 in would prevent the conversational nature of a text message, that you couldn't put, hi, this is Phil with no one measure you, top funders, because at that point you've ruined the conversation because you've talked about who your funders are in your introduction.
Okay. All right.
Can I interject?
Do other commissioners have comments?
Yeah, well, because I think when Tosker came to us wanting an exception to disclosure, it was because they didn't get as good a results when they had to put the disclosures in. They did, because it broke down that feeling that you're having a conversation with somebody and made it feel like you're being spammed or you're being advertised to. But in fact, you are being advertised to. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm not a fan of the long drawn-out disclaimers, but if we're going to, apply them some places, we should apply them fairly. And this feels like a little bit too much of trying to come up with a loophole just because modern technology is cool or something. No.
Other commissioner comments?
If I could, on the issue, I think, about the width, I think it appeared in B2, the comments. Myself, as somebody who spent countless hours walking precincts and phone banking, and predates my commission participation, we commonly say with, and it's not raised questions like, typically the person on the other end of the line would say, well, now who are you with again? That's what they say, and that's how it's conversational. And of course, text messages are, by their nature, are brief. So to the extent that you can say with and convey the same message and save several words, I don't see any masking of the identity of the funder just as a result of that. Now, separately, if you don't disclaim the top funder at all, that's a whole different question. But I would say I'm with the Firefighters Political Action Committee about this message, or Assembly Committee for Tom Jones. That's no offense, Thomas. The message is clear enough.
I think I see a distinction between paid for by, which is very clear to me, and with, because I think you can be with somebody and not necessarily disclose who's actually paying for the text message. I think the purpose of the disclaimer in these circumstances is to provide that type of information to the recipient and the public at large. So I see it as a watering down of the objective of disclosure. I'm curious whether staff, I think we currently have a support position on this bill prior to these amendments. Does staff have a recommendation as to whether or not we might wish to reconsider that position?
We did not come to one. At this time, we just wanted to raise the issues so that you were aware that you had a support position on a prior bill that has been substantially amended, and the policies that you adopted that support position. My apologies, Mr. Chair, I did realize that there is one other change that I forgot to point out, and that would be on page 3. This is, sorry, I'm trying to track it here. This is small b4, which is right in the middle, which talks about impracticability or severely interfere with the committee's ability to convey its message. If the committee believes that due to technology that it's impracticable, they do not need to include the top funders. They just need to include the name. And I only raise that because legal's belief is that if this bill passes in this form, there'll be a number of interpretive, if not regulation, definitely letters interpreting factors that would need to go into what is impracticable when it comes to text messages. Currently in the bill, if you need to spread the text message across a number of text messages, it's not considered impracticable. And so we're not exactly sure when a text message would be impracticable, but they have put this provision in there, and so it's something that you should be aware of as a commission.
The issue of impracticability is, that's sort of raised as part of the Disclose Act anyway, right? So that issue is coming down the pipe no matter what.
Right. And to your prior question, I think your point about with would be the major concern that staff would have about the difference between this bill that we had a support position on before and what it is now today. There's some other things that are probably less concerning to staff, but that is the major concern that staff had with the changes.
Okay, thank you. Is there any public comment on this item? Mr. Lang.
Trent Lang, California Clean Money Campaign, sponsor of the California Disclose Act. The original version of this bill, we very strongly opposed unless amended, because the original version of the bill did not require the top two funders in any circumstance, and also allowed the possibility of just showing a committee number instead of the a URL with information or the name itself. So fortunately, that was able to be changed. With these changes that are in the most recent version of the bill, which we strongly advocated for, we believe this is now a very strong representative of the Disclose Act. And in fact, we have stepped forward to officially sponsor the bill, and we're joining us in that capacity. We consider the current code has a significant distinction in the case of phone banking for phone calls. And in our view, text messaging is very much like, it's analogous to phone banking. You have a similar sort of conversational flow. The current code for phone banking says that when their phone banking is done by paid staffers, they must include disclosures. They do not require in phone banking specific terminology. They don't require them to say paid for by. They require you to say the name of the committee that's paying for it, et cetera, but you don't have the exact, what is the exact formatting that it has to be done in. But it does not require phone banks done by volunteers for the volunteers who are making the phone calls to have actually any disclosure at all. And I think even though the phone banks themselves are, of course, in many cases being paid for by the campaign, the office space, the phone calling, et cetera. So when we looked at this, there seems to be a serious distinction between robotexts and texts that are paid for by a campaign using paid staffers that really aren't doing it because they believe in the cause. They're doing it because they're hired gun and they are being paid for by the committee and directly by those top two funders, versus volunteers, like in the phone banking case, where they are, the volunteers are not being paid. They may not know who the top funders are themselves at all. So that's why we thought that it was appropriate to require that when they are done by paid staffs or robotext, that there they must show the top two funders, because they are very akin to an advertisement. But when it's more of a conversational sort of a situation, when it's done by a volunteer who may not actually even know who the top two funders are, that there it's more reasonable to be like the phone banking situation, and therefore they do need to identify the committee that's paying for it. In this case, we would say that would important. We'd actually argue that they should do that in the case of volunteer phone banking as well, but that's not the subject of this bill. But not necessarily the top two funders, because that volunteer is not being paid for by those top two funders. And the use of with, as Commissioner Hatch said, is a much more conversational tone that normal volunteers would have. Those were the reasons that we put in, recommended those changes to the bill.
Thank you. Any other additional public comment? Back to AB 201, I would make a motion that we change our position from support to support if amended. And in particular, that's because of the addition of with and the exception for unpaid volunteers sending mass technology.
I would second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch? Commissioner Hayward?
Aye.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you, Commissioners. The next bill I'd like to highlight is Assembly Bill 902, which is number 4 on your legislative packet, but you should have been handed a draft as well. The change to this bill looks extensive. It's been, I'm not sure why Legislative Council decided to just do it this way, but they did. And really the only change, there were technical changes that council added that we asked for, and then there was a substantive change that was added on page 5 of the bills that you're looking at, and that would be C, small c, to big B. And that is the addition of $5,000 or more in the aggregate to the committee. That is the newest addition to that provision. Previously, prior to this amendment, yes.
Could you repeat those references?
Yes.
While you-
You should be on, Commissioner, page 5 of 8. And that's small c, number 2, letter big B, capital B.
C, there's a C. Okay.
Yep.
Two. You say big B?
Big B.
Okay, thank
And
you.
so, under current law, it reads, a person who is an existing top 10 contributor makes additional contributions, and then there's a period, or to the committee, period. There has now been addition of $5,000 or more in the aggregate. Our understanding is, at least my understanding, since I've been gone the last couple of months, is this is a request made by the CPAA. And at the last commission meeting, the commission essentially said that we weren't going to add it ourselves as sponsors, but they should go to the legislature and make the case. They have successfully made the case. And Mr. Levine has added essentially a substantive amendment to our non-substantive regulation cleanup bill. And we are sponsors of that bill. And so at this time, staff is essentially asking if the commission wants to continue being sponsors, or they just wish to withdraw their sponsorship and maybe change to a support during the last month of session.
Can I ask a question real quick? Is this the CPAA proposal that initially they were looking for $10,000 steps? And we're now to 5?
Yeah, correct.
I think for, these big committees that, this only applies to committees that raise $1 million or more, $5,000 step is probably reasonable. I mean, it doesn't feel egregious to me, and certainly a $3 step is a very difficult thing to keep track of. So,
Other commissioner comments?
Just a point of clarification, Phil. Because they've recast this, it's difficult to know what the actual changes are. So is this reference you said to large B under C2, is that the only distinction between that and the previous version of the bill?
That's the only substantive change.
Substantive,
There
okay.
were small technical change, cleanup changes we had requested,
Okay,
yeah.
Sure. All right, thank you.
And for some reason, rather than just making those small line outs, council just said, we'll just do the whole thing over. So that's why it looks like this.
I kind of tend to agree with Commissioner Hayward that it seems like a reasonable change. However, it's not our change. And so perhaps we should consider changing our position to reflect that it's not a sponsorship. But I'll hold that until it's time to make motions.
I had a question for staff. Has staff had the opportunity to evaluate whether the $5,000 threshold as proposed by CPA and amended into this bill is going to have any negative impacts on disclosure?
When I reviewed the top 10 list from the last cycle, the contributors that had qualified for the top 10 were giving in the 5, 6, or 7-digit amounts. So pretty large numbers. So a change of 5,000 seemed relatively small compared to the amount of money that they were giving to qualify for a top 10 for $1 million campaign. If that answers your question, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Cardenas, do you have any? All right, I tend to agree with Commissioner Hatch. I mean, it's more of a matter of principle. We sponsored this bill for purposes of making technical, non-substantive changes. There has been an amendment which now makes a substantive change. We didn't ask for that. We didn't propose that. So I would make a motion that we change our position from sponsor to support on this particular bill. But before we vote on that, is there any public comment on that item? Hearing none. Do I have a second?
A second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
yes.
Chair Matich?
Yes,
The motion passes.
thank you. All right, Mr. Young.
Thank you, Commissioners. The next bill that I'd like to highlight is Assembly Bill 946, which is our omnibus non-substantive bill. This bill came off the inactive file. Before I left for my leave, it was placed on inactive file because it was moving almost too quickly through the legislative process, to the point that the legislature wanted to put some brakes on it because there was a chance that they needed to make some chaptering out or joinder amendments. It has now come off of an active file with chaptering out or joinder amendments because there's concurrent legislation that's moving that amend the same sections. But otherwise, those amendments are purely technical, non-substantive. The bill continues to be an omnibus, non-substantive bill.
Okay, so this is just double joining amendments.
It's just double joining, yeah. And so I just wanted to make you aware of those changes to one of our sponsored bills. Otherwise, there's no action to be taken on this one from staff standpoint.
Thank you.
Any commission comment?
Does everyone in the room know what a double joining amendment means?
Sorry.
My apologies, legislative lingo. So essentially, when two bills are moving at the same time and they both amend the same section, if you don't put a double joinder provision in there, if one bill is approved and chaptered and then the subsequent bill is approved and chaptered, the subsequent bill will essentially cancel out the amendments for the first bill. And so you have to put in double joinder provisions to essentially say, regardless of which one gets passed first, these provisions will essentially all go into effect.
And if only one gets signed, then only the one provision.
Then only the one provision gets, yes, that's right.
All right. Any additional comments on 946? All right. Thank you, Mr. Ung.
Yep. The last bill that staff would like to bring to your attention is Assembly Bill 1217, which deals with issue and electioneering advertisements. The commission currently has opposed unless amended position on the bill. The bill received substantive amendments this morning. And so the draft that you were looking at for Assembly Bill 1217 is fresh off the printer. And staff has had, I think we got this at 2 or 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. So we've had a little bit of time to review it and to provide you with some comments on what we're seeing within the bill. Sorry, Dave, I'm going to borrow my copy. The first thing that you will notice in the bill, despite the huge number of strikeout, they've essentially rewritten the entire bill, is that under the electioneering, the definition of electioneering, which is on page 2 of 12, at the bottom of page 2, it has narrowed the types of offices that this that this restriction would apply to just state offices, elected state offices. Yes. Prior to that, it was any elected office in the state, so it has narrowed that universe significantly. And on issue ads, it has done the same thing. It has narrowed it to only state, legislative, and administrative issues, not just any legislative or administrative issue throughout the state or local.
So no school districts.
So we're not being asked to look at issue ads for school districts or local governments or county supervisors or anything. The other thing you'll notice on the bottom of page 2 is they have added a 45-day window. They have changed that. Prior to that, it was a 60-day window and a 30-day window, depending on the election. The 45-day window matches with our current statute under 85310, which is our current electioneering provision of 45 days prior to an election.
Would you mind, as you do these, tell us if that's one of the things that we had asked for or not?
That one was one of the things we had asked for, yes, was for them to be aligned. I'll make sure I get back to that. There still is some, not complication, but some relationship between what this is asking and 85310 that may cause some confusion for the regulated community. So I'll come back to that after a full briefing. And then there's a whole list of exceptions. Staff has looked at these exceptions. I think it would be generous to say we've fully evaluated the effect of all of these exceptions and how they could be used to essentially escape disclosure if abused. Some of these exceptions are the same as the Disclose Act exceptions. Some of them are new. And so I wanted to flag that for the commission as well.
Which ones are the new ones? Can you tell us?
Let me see here.
Page do you start on?
That's on page 3, sorry.
Page 3?
Yes.
3, oh, okay. All right, I was on the wrong page. Thank you.
Let me see here. I think there was only one that I saw that I needed to follow up Big G, a communication that clearly identifies a candidate for state elective office for purposes of featuring that candidate's endorsement, support, or opposition. That's not something that's currently in Disclose Act.
Okay.
The media one is, I think, just common sense, which is I.
Aye.
And then H raised some questions on my standpoint because if it's a communication directed to voters or potential voters as part of a voter registration activity or activities encouraging or assisting persons to vote. I thought of a possible communication that essentially was an electioneering communication, but at the end encouraged people to register to vote. Would that escape disclosure because it's asking people to register to vote, but 90% of it is for the most part an electioneering communication.
But if it's solely about registering to vote, that wouldn't be a problem in your view, or is it?
If it's solely about registering to vote, I think that's probably a clean one, but the current exception does not say solely. It just says a commission directed to voters as part of a voter registration effort.
So your thought was a mixed message of some other things and
correct
voter registration to slip under the radar. Okay.
Yes. So those are the ones. I appreciate provision M, which gives us the flexibility to craft more exceptions if we need to. That's always helpful. And then moving on, the next couple of pages, 4 and 5, describe electioneering ads issue ads. And those exceptions, the exceptions are essentially the same as the electioneering advertisements. And so I think the concerns are still relatively the same, although the context may be different since issue ads are diametrically different than electioneering ads. Now you have to skip a number of pages to get to page 10, which is where the disclosure portion of the bill starts. Yeah, and this is section number 84552 that's being proposed to be added to the Political Reform Act. For anybody following at home. And this is where I would want to flag the relationship between 85310, our current electioneering provision, and what's being offered here in 1217. Under 85310, if a communication is made and $50,000 is spent, then that communication needs to be disclosed in a filing to the Secretary of State's office. And included in that filing needs to be any donors who spent $5,000 or more for that communication. So you have those two thresholds, and it requires reporting to the Secretary of State's office. The thresholds being established here in 1217 are $10,000 thresholds. And this is not a reporting to the Secretary of State. This is a disclaimer on an ad. So if you are an entity who is making an electioneering communication, you need to pay very close attention to these two thresholds because you have two very different requirements. If you cross the $50,000 threshold, you need to disclose to the Secretary of State's office. If not, if you cross the $10,000 threshold, then you're disclosing on an ad, and you're only disclosing top donors of $10,000 or more. But again, if you're under 85310, if you have $50,000 and you have a donor that's $5,000 or more, you're disclosing that to the Secretary of State's office. So me just verbally describing this and seeing your faces, you can see where the confusion may lie going forward when it comes to implementation.
Are they also relate to electioneering?
Yes.
Okay.
And so that's where that relationship plays out. I think it's not fatal to the bill, but it definitely will cause confusion and might require some cleanup, either of 85310 or of this bill, to help sync those two sections up for the sake of the regulated community.
Is there time to do that before the next election cycle, though? I mean, we're heading into an election year. We're changing the rules in a way that you've just described as inconsistent and confusing.
We have 15 days to amend this bill. So there's time to do that. I mean, we could carry legislation next year, and have urgency an urgency clause put into it, but the first election next year is in March.
Right. That's my point, is
Yeah.
I feel like one way of looking at this is we'd be supporting a bill that would create confusion and inconsistency, and we don't have an opportunity to fix that before the next election cycle.
Now, I would point out that this is not an issue that was raised by staff in our analysis prior to us seeing this, and so for the sake of the author, they have made a good faith effort to try to address our issues. But looking at these thresholds and looking at the relationship between the two, they did address the day issue, the 45 days issue, but when you look at the two played together, it's incredibly confusing for some folks.
And of course, they can't address the underlying constitutional question about whether any of this is lawful and whether we're going to be in court on this the next day after it's signed into law.
I was gonna end my routine with that, Mr. Chair, but, yeah.
Casca, is there any discussion or possibility that this becomes a 2-year bill, so that instead of rushing through something which is imperfect and would cause confusion on the eve of election, that we take our time and try to do it right?
There has not been discussion of that I've been privy to. Dave, have you? No.
Could I ask a question on this difference in the threshold amounts? Are they as to the same activity within the electioneering category, or are they interlaced, so to speak? This 10,000 applies to one set of electioneering activities, and the other has electioneering activities, but they're different ones, or are they literally the same?
The definition of electioneering communication is essentially the same as 85310, which says that the communication clearly identifies a candidate and does not expressly advocate for the election or defeat of that candidate. It's the same definition.
Okay, so
type of
just for
communication.
guidance, if you were going to have to change one of them, which one provides more disclosure than the other? Would it be this language or the current section?
Well, they provide disclosures in different, this bill provides disclosures on an ad, and then the other provides disclosure to the Secretary of State's office, which anybody can access at any time.
That's not an ad?
Well, they're both. I mean, the disclosure that goes to the Secretary of State's office is triggered because you paid for a communication. And so you're really looking at two different types of disclosures, right? You're looking at a
So
form.
then they're not the
and
same.
then-
That's what I was trying to get at, are they the same? Do they disagree with each other, or are they governing different activity than each other?
They do not disagree with each other.
Okay.
There's no conflict.
Okay.
It's just confusing.
Confusing in the sense that the numbers are different, but there's no actual conflict between the two.
For one communication, you trigger a number of different disclosure
And so if you were
requirements.
going to harmonize or clarify the lack, or the potential confusion, would it be better to go with the lower number or the bigger numbers that are currently in the law?
I think our default as a commission is for a lower number for disclosure threshold if we wanted more disclosure. And so in this case, you would amend 85310 from $50,000 to $10,000, which is a
Okay,
pretty
thank you.
significant change. Yeah.
It's a minor thing, but I'm just curious, because I notice in this bill, the disclaimer would include the words "ad paid for by." In 201, the disclaimer is "paid for by." So what if any additional benefit is being provided by requiring folks to use the word "ad" as a modifier?
I believe 201 permits both paid for by, ad, paid for by, and with.
Well, setting aside why we would allow 3 different options.
Yes.
My question, though, is if paid for by is good enough, why are we saying "ad paid for by"? What are we?
Oh, we had that discussion during the Disclose Act days, and I'm going to defer to Trent Lang on that one. Because I think they see a substantive difference between the two.
Okay. Are there any other issues in this bill that we have covered?
Yeah, since we are in that disclosure section on 10, let me see here. They used the same earmarking exception and definition as the Disclose Act. When the Disclose Act went through, there was quite the controversy with dues, assessments, fees, and similar payments made to membership organizations. They're essentially bringing that exception into an electioneering and issue ad context. At the time, the commission that was at the time had issues with that particular section. Wanted to flag that since it's now being replicated in two other parts of the act with these new provisions.
Are they consistent or are they different?
It's almost exactly the same language. Yeah. And they have added some record-keeping requirements, I believe, which is one of the requests from the commission, is that enforcing these provisions would be incredibly difficult if there was no disclosure to the Secretary of State's office. If you had a chance to read Mr. Lang's letter that came in at 10:30 this morning, that is to them a compromise because the Secretary of State is not adding any new disclosure as they're building the Cal Access system. And so for now, they're asking that people who pay for these ads keep records of it. And for both electioneering and issue ads. The one thing I flagged for the issue ads is they're required to keep records. The question that I raised is what happens if they're lobbying employers and they're currently filing with the Secretary of State's office and they run one of these ads. I'm not sure what their disclosure requirement would be on their current 600 forms, I believe 600 forms, versus just keeping records that we would ask for later on.
Talk about keeping records, you're really talking about not destroying documents, isn't that the sense what that's about?
It doesn't go into detail as to what it means to keep records. Let me try to find the provision for you, Commissioner.
Yeah, I can help. Yeah, that's essentially what it means is you have to retain these records, a legal requirement to keep them.
That's what I thought. Thank you.
And the last thing I would add is this bill has its own set of disclosure requirements that are less strict than the Disclose Act, but the bill also says now that if you just simply use the Disclose Act disclosures, you have met and complied with the disclosure requirements of this bill. So I'll let you digest that.
Which behavior here now are we talking about? And whereabouts are we talking?
For both issue ads and electioneering ads.
Two different kinds of things.
Right.
Yeah.
If you were to use the type of disclaimer required by the Disclose Act, this bill says that you've met the disclosure requirements for issue and electioneering ads. Or you could use the less strict requirement, which is also being prescribed in 1217.
Okay.
And I think that's all I have for this simple bill.
All right. Is there a commissioner comment on this bill?
I've been on the record as thinking the whole enterprise is not a good idea, so I'm continuing to be opposed to it.
There's a number of issues that have been raised here, and I would defer until after I've heard the public comment to figure out what I think about it.
Commissioner Cardenas, anything you want to? Okay, let's go ahead and take public comment on this matter.
Hi, Trent Lang, California Clean Money Campaign. First, just to step back a second, I think that this is an incredibly important issue for expanding disclosure in areas that currently are not do not require any disclosure on ads at all. Electioneering communications are especially a distinct and major loophole to the Disclose Act. We wish to address it back in the time that we were doing the Disclose Act. We were not able to get that through the legislature at that time. But when you have an ad that names or depicts a candidate and may attack them or overly or praise them very much, but you just don't use the magic words to say vote for or against, that should have full Disclose Act disclosures. That is the purpose of this electioneering communication portion of this bill, because it is currently a significant loophole. Yes, they have to report to the Secretary of State when they've made over $50,000 worth, but that's not good enough for the voters. On the issue advocacy lobbying piece, that is also a part that we are seeing dramatically increased spending in terms of special interests attacking bills. They spend millions of dollars doing so, or supporting bills and influencing the legislature. They are lobbying by another name, but currently there are no on-ad disclosure requirements at all. So yes, there are. This is a complex bill. There's no doubt about it to fill in these details, but it is following right in the footsteps of the California Disclose Act. That is the goal of doing so. We were very pleased to meet with the chair and staff with the author's office back in June, and we heard the the specific requests of the commission in terms of those three items, and I think those are now addressed as well as we could. We'd like to be able to require disclosure filing requirements to the Secretary of State, but Cal Access isn't ready for that. As we discussed at that time, we will certainly be very happy, and I'm sure the author will be as well, to once the new Cal Access site is up to do a bill that would include additional actual filing disclosures to build upon the record keeping. To do so. It is a good point about the difference in the threshold between, I think, the definition of election communication in existing 85310 and this. Now we've narrowed it, so they're both now the 45 days as staff requested. That is a good point about the difference between $10,000 and $50,000, the difference between the two. And if that ends up being the difference between your being able to remove your opposition in terms of the things, then I will certainly be happy to recommend to the author that they make those two numbers match up one way or the other in doing so. But with that, we would hope that we'd say this is a very important policy. Yes, it will very likely be legally challenged, but the commission and staff raised those similar sorts of concerns about the Disclose Act, that it would be legally challenged, and certainly that was a possibility, and it still remains a possibility. But that did not stop. That did not make the commission at that time vote to oppose the bill, the Disclose Act at the time. It has not led to an actual legal challenge, knock on wood, so far. And so we'd ask that hopefully that you could, if you not support the bill, at least remove your opposition given these changes that we've made.
Thank you.
And
Did you address some of the specific points that Phil made that were I would classify them as new issues, other than the three that you've made attempts to comply with requests in the past?
We have not, the bill does not address the difference between the $10,000 threshold for electioneering communications in the bill for ads and $50,000. It was not requested by the commission before. If that is a significant issue, I can see the value of actually making that change, so I'd be happy to recommend. And if the commission decides to oppose unless amended to make those just change it to just oppose unless amended to make that change, and you can make that change in time, that would be, I think that would be a very workable solution, or support if amended. We can happily recommend that. Let's see, what else was there something else that I was missing from that you raised as a question?
Communications directed to voters.
Enforcement cause.
As part of registration activities, I think the issue that Phil raised.
Yeah, the exceptions.
That exception, whether or not it was intended to be, or could be made more clear that it's composed exclusively of that, as opposed to mixing it in with other things that would not be accepted.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe it'd be worth discussing. We'd be happy to discuss with the author's office, especially if you recommend it, to clarify that to, I don't know, that the majority purpose of the ad is the voter registration, as opposed to, I don't know if that would help your enforcement. You're right. It would be a problem if 90% of the ad was really, Joe Blow is a great candidate, he's going to lower everybody's taxes and make your grass greener. And by the way, get out and vote. That would be, I could see that as being a problem. So maybe some clarifying language would be useful, and I think there's still time to do that if staff would like to help make some recommendations on how to do that.
And I think there was one other, but I can't remember, Phil. I didn't mark it down, that you had pointed out that was new, that you had raised
the endorsement. the endorsement exception, where it clearly identifies a candidate for elective office for purposes for featuring that candidate's endorsement, support, or opposition to another candidate or ballot measure.
And
It's just a new exception that we hadn't seen before.
okay, and so you're not necessarily pointing out that that is bad or
No, I was
good?
flagging it for the commission, just so you were aware that it's a new exception that we hadn't seen before. And so we haven't had time to really evaluate
So you're not
the
sure
effect
whether
of that
it's bad or-
exception and how it could
Okay.
be exposed or used.
Okay, all right.
I would think on that point that more often than not, the ad would have to have the disclosure for the candidate or ballot measure that is being endorsed, more often than not. And as an exception, remember that none of these ads have any disclosure requirements at all right now. So if there's an exception here that is abused, then certainly we will be the first ones requesting tightening in future legislation, as we've done with the Disclose Act, to make sure that it's not abused in such a manner in the future.
Yeah, you have a good track record on coming back and cleaning up things. We'll grant that. I think there's a lot of good here. And I do think that there's an opportunity to maybe refine it a little further. I'm concerned about the exclusivity, whether or not it's you know, the exemption or exception is for exclusively voter registration, as opposed to mixing. I'd hate to put staff in the part of having to weigh, well, is it 49% or 52% or something like that, when really any mixture would make it problematic. At the right time, I would like to make a motion.
Do we have other additional commissioner comments?
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Lang.
I see.
I'm wondering if, I'm struggling with this one, because on the one hand, I think, Mr. Lang, I mean, you clearly identified an important area where there is not currently any disclosure, or very limited disclosure, if you set aside the SOS requirements. So I think that's good. On the other hand, I mean, first of all, there's a constitutional question about whether we can even do this. But even setting that aside, this bill, we've sat up here and we've identified a number of issues to work out. We are on the eve of an election, a state election. Our agency would be tasked with trying to enforce and implement these rules on a very short timeline going into an election year, with additional cleanup work remaining to be done. I'm wondering if a potential compromise here might be to amend the bill to add an effective date of January 1st, 2021, in order to allow us sufficient time to further refine the bill next year. I mean, that gives us an opportunity to do that. We can staff up over that period of time. Everybody's going to have an opportunity to start thinking about what these new rules would look like, as opposed to trying to roll this out and enforce and implement this on a very short timeline. So that's a thought I had. I don't know how the other commissioners feel about that.
How would you feel about a delayed effective date that's half that long? So like, get you past the primary so that this doesn't have to be implemented in the primary, which is on a very short leash. So say 7/1/20.
My only concern with that is I think in order to legislatively address some of the issues we talked about today, we'd have to do that wouldn't that have to be urgency legislation next year then? I mean, on the ordinary course, if we're going to have a bill to amend this to fix some of the things we've talked about, it wouldn't be until the end of the year, right?
That's correct. But I would also point out that only one part of this bill, the electioneering part, is connected to the election. The other part, the issue ad part, is connected to issues moving through a government agency, whether it's the legislature or an administrative agency. And so a halfway delay, I'm not sure how that would work.
Your point's well taken, but I'm just saying that, the primary is coming upon us pretty early. And to have to do it effective the first of the year would be very difficult. But I could also see benefit in allowing this to go into effect in such a way that it could be applicable to general election activities. That's all I was.
Other commissioners' response to that? Mr. Lang?
I cannot speak for the author on that a possibility of delay. I do see some potential benefits to it, especially, say, a July 1, 2020 announcement, because especially when it comes to electioneering communications, it will only apply in the 45 days before the election. So that would be after the primary, so you don't have to worry about rushing regulations out in time for that. And any fix-it bill will be required to be a 2/3 vote bill, so it could easily be an urgency bill. Basically, any bill going through the legislature at normal speed with a 2/3 vote with an urgency clause would be able to go into effect in time for the 45 days.
Your point is that because it amends the PRA, it's got to be 2/3 vote anyway, so it's not an additional.
It's not an additional challenge to make an urgency clause. So,
point well taken.
It's not an additional challenge as in the vote threshold doesn't change, but I think it's an additional challenge from just obviously an implementation standpoint. The one comment I would make is this bill itself has an urgency clause in it. And so if it was to be signed into law, we would be implementing at least the issue ad portion of it for any administrative actions.
This year?
This year.
Okay. So perhaps a July 1 date sounds more attractive than it might have otherwise.
I think Mr. Young's, I could be wrong, but I thought your point was January 1st, 2021. Implementation sort of checked all the
No, I
boxes.
think what he said is this thing could go into effect in its current form with the urgency clause in September after the governor signs the bill.
Right. And having, I guess,
Sooner than January of this year.
delaying it to July 1st, 2020, you'd essentially have half a legislative cycle where any ads run wouldn't have disclaimers, and then the last half with disclaimers for issue
different
ads.
elections.
And so you have, I mean, you could attach different implementation dates to different parts of the bill, if you'd like.
That's another possibility. Yeah.
Can carve this up however we'd like, if obviously the author and sponsor approve.
All right, is there any additional commissioner comment on this item? All right, any additional public comment? All right.
I think the number of issues have been raised that may or may not be able to be fixed in the short time left. But in order to provide maximum opportunity for those things to happen and not do any undue damage to the efforts on the bill, considering the good faith efforts that have been made so far, I would like to move that we change our position to support if amended and allow staff and the sponsors to continue to work on this. And it might, just sort of looking ahead, if there was a sense that we would want to consider going to unqualified support, that would require some, because either, obviously it would be too late to do it at our next regular scheduled meeting, so there may be a possibility, or so if magic happens and there's peace in Valley and the amendments are recommended by staff, that we might be able to hold a teleconference meeting of the commission to consider whether or not we change the position. That's not a part of the motion, by the way. Just the motion was simply to change the position from its current position to support if amended, which means we're neutral until we figure something out.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. For supportive amended positions or opposed unless amended positions, I think it's helpful to staff if we knew what amendments the commission would like to see made to the bill.
Well, I, for one, would like to consider whether or not we consider, instead of an urgency date, effect, by default because it's urgency, a delayed implementation date on key provisions of the bill to July 1 of 20. I also would like to see some progress made on this issue of voter registration exemption so that it's exclusively so. What was the other one? Too many moving parts.
Would you like to see 85310 aligned
Oh,
also?
yes, the alignment between existing law and that new requirement. I'm not particularly hung up on which standard we go to, but I tend to favor more disclosure over less.
Right.
And those are my opinions. I still have a motion before the
Thank you.
before the body.
Commissioner Cardenas, did you have a comment? Would you consider amending your motion to provide specifically that its support, unless amended, among other things, to include an effective date of January 1st, 2021?
It's a little tough for me because I favor the July 1 date. I would generalize that we make it a condition that we provide a delayed date, and that we can work amongst us as to what that may be. And the sponsors, they may resist that, I don't know. But I would happy to condition it upon some delayed effective date.
What do other commissioners think?
I still oppose the whole idea, sorry. I am so incredibly unhelpful right now.
That's usually my position. Once again, the advantage to the July 1 target, it sounds right to me, although I am concerned about kind of having bifurcated practices within one election in motion. But can you remind me the advantage to or the contemplated advantage to a July 1?
To me, the advantage was under the current form of the bill, it's an urgency statute, so it would go in effect in September of this year. I would like to delay it, at least the key provisions that affect elections, to July 1st so that it gets after the primary, so that the commission is not jammed up trying to do regulations to implement stuff for the primary election, which is what, in March? Yeah, so that's pretty short. So that's where I see the benefit. Is that helpful?
It is, but it might have moved me in the other direction. So we would have different rules for the primary versus the general.
Correct.
That's really interesting. So we would have one set of rule where we've got party combatants going against each other, and then another one for a general.
Right, and these are levels of disclosure that are not available now. And a lot of this stuff is very damaging, the activity itself. And so I'd like to do it as soon as possible. If it wasn't such a gymnastic act to try and make this effective January 1st of this year, I would be certainly looking for that. But I get it, that's not possible. To delay it until January of 21 means a lot of vicious activity could still occur without disclosure in the general election. That's where majority of the money is spent, especially ballot measures now are only at the general election. The primary election does not, by current law, the ballot measures are all supposed to be on the general election for the state candidates. So I don't see a double standard on ballot measures, and I think that's a big part of this, that this is going to help clean up.
Strong, did you have something you wanted to add?
I just want to clarify that this is not about advocating for the support or passage of something on a ballot or the election of somebody on a ballot, as much as it's communications that reference a candidate who happens to be on the ballot within 45 days of that election. And the other point I would make is, right now Commissioner Hatch is talking about the July 1st, 2020 date for the electioneering portion of the bill. And I just want to bring up the issue add portion of the bill applies to both state legislative and administrative work. And a July 2020 date for a legislative work would be 2/3 through the legislative cycle. As we all know, administrative actions take place year-round. And so there's not really a convenient time to do administrative stuff, although most agencies work on a January 1st timeline.
Do we have any other staff input on this?
I just want to make sure that the commission is clear that there's essentially two bills here. One has to do with electioneering ads. The other has to do with what is called issue lobbying. It's the issue lobbying component that stands apart from any particular election. It affects governmental decision-making. So even with a July 2020 date, that will become live that night, that it will affect all ads for people who want to change decision-making at the legislature. So we'll be essentially trying to build that boat in the middle of the legislative session while we're trying to do regulations for the election component of it.
And yet, I'm not adverse to making that delayed effective date apply to that as well.
And that's completely up to the commission. I just wanted to make sure that the commission understood the ramifications.
Right. Do I have a second, Mr. Chair?
The motion is support unless amended, among other things, to include an effective date at least of July 1st, 2020.
Well, I could make that a part of it, but my motion didn't actually do that. I talked about what my preferences were as potential guidance, but I would be happy to amend the motion to include that if you like.
Yes.
Okay, I so modify my motion. Delayed effective date to July 1st.
Can we just, let's to make the record clear, can you state your motion again?
Okay. My motion was to change our position to support if amended, conditioned upon a delayed effective date to July 1st, at least July 1st of 2020, with strong preference being expressed that we delay it to January 1st of 2021. Is that sufficient?
Yes. I'll second that.
Okay.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
No.
Chair Matich?
Yes.
The motion passes.
That's all I have unless there are questions on any other pieces of legislation.
So what have you been doing for us lately?
Tried to do the best I can last 2 weeks.
Rhetorical.
See you next month.
I would seriously feel very well done. Your mastery of all these moving parts is tremendous.
Oh, good, okay, sorry.
All right, moving to item 17 then. This is the advice letter report and commission review. Welcome to the table, Council Lau. How are you?
I'm good.
All right. Do commissioners have any advice letters they wish to pull or talk about? Hearing none.
Well, Frederick from a few years ago, but that's a whole nother.
Just let that be for now. A public comment on the advice letter report. Hearing none, let's move to item 18, our executive staff reports. Let's go ahead and begin with the Enforcement Division, Chief of Enforcement, West. Do commissioners have any questions or any items from the Enforcement Division report that they want to discuss?
I do, but I defer to Commissioner Hayward if she has any.
No, I don't.
Okay, go for it.
I would disclose that I did read each and every one of the of the deferred actions proposed by our Enforcement Division, and I would have to say, another job well done. Thank you.
Any public comment on the Enforcement Division report? Going once. Thank you, Ms. West. All right, moving on to the Legal Division report. Mr. Bainbridge. Any commissioner items that they wish to discuss from Mr. Bainbridge's report?
Yes. On the CSAC litigation, at my own expense, I would really like to be able to go to view the actual court appearance when, so if you wouldn't mind, let me know when they've set that date so that I can do that.
Yeah, I'll make sure.
I don't plan to talk. I just want to watch.
I don't think the judge would let you anyway. Yeah, I'll make sure you get the schedule for once they set it.
Thank you.
All right, any public comment on the Legal Division report? Seeing none. Executive Director Jones, Administration, Technology, or Ms. Hahn.
You've already seen the budget. That was the major thing that we did in the contract, so I really have nothing to add.
Thank you. All right, any public comment on this item? Seeing none. All right, thank you. Do any commissioners have any matters not on the agenda that they wish to discuss? All right, there's one matter that I wanted to raise, and that is that I would like for staff at the next meeting to come back to the commission with an informational item for the commissioner's benefit that identifies the current rules of conduct, internal rules of conduct that exist and apply to commissioners. It's my understanding that at some point in the past, we actually adopted a policy manual, if you will, to govern our internal operations. But it's also my understanding that there may be multiple versions of that manual. And so it's not clear to me which one is in effect right now, what it says, et cetera. So I think it'd be helpful for the commission to receive that information from staff. And then the commission can decide at that time whether, if any, action needs to be taken on that. So it'd simply be an informational item to be brought back to the commission next meeting.
For action at a later date, correct?
Correct. I think the first things first. Let's figure out what's out there.
Will the chair entertain a question?
Of course.
I was going to ask the commission while you're all here, have any of you during your tenure voted on a commissioner's manual or set of policies for commissioners?
When I first joined the commission, I was given a manual, and then one of the things that got the governance principles started was being told that manual actually only applied when certain people thought it should, and that there were things in it that were never really adopted. And I can scan it for you and show it to you. But yeah, we got a manual, but we didn't really get a manual that was being applied to us.
Yep.
If that makes sense. And we never voted on it.
Yeah, we never voted on it. I would just make a distinction, though, there are pieces that are in that manual that separately were voted on the commissions prior to us, and they're so noted.
My departure has nothing to do with the manual, just to be clear. I need to catch an Uber.
All right, thank you. I really just wanted to know if there was a meeting that I could go to where it was voted on and pull it off the agenda there.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you won't find that, but like I say, there are pieces in there, like, for instance, there's this is not the right title, but there's, in effect, a code of conduct for the commissioner's behavior that does have an adoption date. It was it's ahead of when I came on the commission, but I understand now there may be other versions of it, and it would be nice to know what we have.
We will do that.
Thank you. Any other comments from the commissioners? Hearing none, do we have a motion to adjourn?
I so move.
Do I get to second this one? Second.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
All right, thank you, everyone.